the street hidden behind a parked car, Max, a stray dog with ragged fur, watched a little girl closely. His eyes followed her every movement. What happened next will make you cry. A winter evening. Rain pelted the streets relentlessly, making every step treacherous for those forced to endure it. Rebecca, only 6 years old, huddled beneath a narrow awning that barely shielded her from the downpour. Her small frame trembled from both the cold and fear. Her soaked hair clung to her face, and the tattered dress she wore offered no warmth, hanging loosely off her fragile body. With a deep breath, she mustered the courage to move again, scanning the streets for any sign of help. Her stomach twisted with hunger, a sharp reminder of the days she'd gone without a proper meal. Desperation took over as she approached a garbage bin, her small hands shaking as she sifted through the waste. Her heart leapt when she found half of a stale bread roll still intact. Quickly, she stuffed it into her pocket, searching for a dry corner where she could sit and eat in peace. Across the street, hidden behind a parked car, Max, a stray dog with ragged fur, watched her closely. His eyes followed her every movement, cautious and wary of people. Humans had never been kind to him, but there was something different about this girl. Against his instincts, Max crept closer, keeping to the shadows, his nose twitching as he caught the faint scent of the bread. Rebecca noticed him before he got too close. Startled, she backed into the wall behind her, clutching the bread tightly in her small fist. Her wide eyes met Max's, and for a moment neither moved. The rain drummed between them like a wall, yet something about Max's presence calmed her. He didn't bark or growl. He simply stood there, his head low, tail gently swaying, his gaze fixed on the bread in her hand. The hunger in his eyes mirrored her own, and despite her gnawing stomach, Rebecca slowly extended her hand, breaking the bread in two. She held out half toward Max, her hand trembling slightly as she offered it. Max hesitated, sniffing the air before stepping forward cautiously. He nipped at the bread and devoured it, his hunger evident. Rebecca smiled faintly as she watched him eat, her fear melting away, replaced by an unexpected warmth. Once Max finished, he circled around her before lying down beside her, pressing his body against her legs. His wet fur felt rough, but the weight and warmth he provided was comforting. Rebecca sighed and leaned back against the wall, nibbling on her half of the bread. It wasn't much, but the small bite she took filled her with something more than food, a sense of companionship. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel completely alone. "You're hungry too, huh?" she whispered, glancing down at Max. He lifted his head, looking up at her as though he understood. "I guess we're both alone." She fell silent for a while, the sound of the rain surrounding them. Then, in a soft voice, she began to speak, as if the storm had given her permission to let out the words she had been holding back. "I don't like it at home," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Mum and Dad, they always yell. Sometimes they hit me. I try to be good, but it's never enough." Max, as if sensing the weight of her words, nudged her with his head, offering what little comfort he could. His eyes softened, and Rebecca felt a lump in her throat, tears threatening to spill. "They hate me," she whispered, her fingers gripping the fabric of her dress. "I think they do. I don't know why." Max growled softly as if in protest, and pressed his head into her lap. Rebecca let out a shaky breath, resting her hand on his fur. "You're the first one who's been nice to me in a long time," she said, her voice breaking. For the rest of the night, Rebecca sat there in the storm with Max by her side, his steady presence easing the ache inside her. The city roared around them, but within their small corner it was just the two of them, a girl and her dog, two lost souls who had found each other amidst the chaos. The park was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. Rebecca sat on the bench, lost in her thoughts, her hand resting lightly on Max's head. The dog, ever alert, occasionally lifted his nose to the air, sensing the world around them. His soft fur was warm under her touch, a small comfort in the stillness. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows of the trees. A man, tall and gaunt with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, walked towards them. He moved slowly, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixated on Rebecca. "Evening," he said, his voice dripping with an attempt at charm. Nice dog you got there. Mind if I sit? Rebecca stiffened, her hand tightening on Max's leash. Something about the man felt wrong. His smile was too forced, his movements too calculated. I'm waiting for someone, she replied, her voice steady but her body tense. The man chuckled, a sound that was too low, too deliberate. No need to be so tense, sweetheart. Just making conversation. He took a step closer, too close for comfort, his eyes now locked on Rebecca. What's your dog's name? Before Rebecca could respond, Max growled, a deep rumbling sound that seemed to shake the air. The dog's hackles rose and his body tensed like a coiled spring, ready to pounce. Easy there, boy, the man said, raising his hands in mock surrender, but his eyes betrayed his frustration. He took another step forward, reaching a hand out towards Rebecca, and that's when Max snapped. The dog's bark cut through the evening air like a crack of thunder. He lunged at the man's leg, teeth sinking into his trousers with a vicious growl. The man stumbled back, cursing under his breath as he tried to shake Max off. Get your dog under control, the man shouted, panic rising in his voice. But Max wasn't backing down. His growls grew louder, more menacing to protect Rebecca. The tension in the air thickened. Rebecca's heart raced as she stood frozen, unsure of what to do. She could feel Max's energy, his unwavering determination to defend her, and it was enough to shake her from her paralysis. Max, come here, she called, her voice trembling, but Max wouldn't budge. The man, now desperate, kicked at the dog, but Max dodged and barked again, louder, more ferocious. It was enough to send the man scrambling back, fear flashing in his eyes as he turned and fled into the fading light. Max stood there, his chest heaving, teeth bared, eyes still locked on the retreating figure. Only when the man was out of sight did Max finally relent, his body relaxing as he returned to Rebecca's side. Tears of relief welled in her eyes. Rebecca's journey was not just a path she walked alone. It was a testament to her strength, her resilience, and the unbreakable bond she shared with Max, her golden retriever. For 4 minutes, we delve into the moments that defined her, the challenges she faced, and the unwavering support she received from her loyal companion. Rebecca drops to her knees, pulling Max into a tight embrace. Rebecca, thank you, Max, she whispers, burying her face in his fur. Max licks her cheek, his tail wagging softly. Max, are you all right, dear? A soft voice interrupts the moment. Rebecca looks up to see an older woman approaching, concern etched across her face. Older woman, I saw what happened. That man. I'm calling an ambulance. You might need to get checked out, and your dog too. He was so brave. Rebecca nods, still holding Max close. Rebecca, thank you. The woman nods and pulls out her phone, dialing quickly. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens can be heard growing louder as they approach. Rebecca strokes Max's fur absent-mindedly, her mind still racing from the encounter, but her heart steady with the knowledge that she wasn't alone. The ambulance arrives. Rebecca looks down at Max, who is sitting calmly by her side, his eyes still alert, but no longer filled with aggression. He had protected her without hesitation, and she knew without a doubt that he always would. The sterile scent of antiseptic clings to the air. Rebecca sits on the edge of the bed, her thin arms wrapped around her knees, eyes hollow with exhaustion. Max, her golden retriever, presses close to her side. Clara, the nurse, gently pulls the curtain back and approaches Rebecca with cautious steps. Clara. Rebecca, we found some things during your checkup. Can you tell me what happened? Rebecca's eyes dart towards the door. Rebecca, they don't like me. They always said I was the problem. At home, I don't remember the last time I wasn't scared. Clara leans in, showing she is listening but doesn't push. Rebecca, my stepfather, he hits me when I don't listen, when I don't do things right. And my mom, she doesn't stop him. She just lets it happen. Max nudges her with his nose. Clara notices Rebecca's small hand gripping Max's fur. Clara, he's a good boy. We'll make sure he stays with you. Joan, the social worker, steps in. Joan, hi Rebecca. I'm here to help you. I want to make sure you're safe. We've already started the process of getting you away from your home. No one is going to hurt you anymore. Rebecca tenses at the mention of home. Max shifts closer. Joan, we're going to get you to a safe place, and Max, he can come too. Rebecca's eyes flicker with the faintest hint of hope. Rebecca, he won't have to stay behind. Joan, no, Max stays with you wherever you go. Rebecca breathes a little easier. Clara and Joan exchange a look. Max wasn't just a pet, he was part of Rebecca's survival. Joan, you're safe now. That's the most important thing, we'll make sure of it. Rebecca nods, her grip tightening on Max. The hospital room feels too quiet. Rebecca lies in bed, staring at the ceiling. Max lays protectively at her side. The door swings open, and her parents stand there, faces twisted in exaggerated worry. Rebecca's mother speaks. "Rebecca, we're taking you home now." Rebecca freezes, her heart racing. Max growls, his stance shifting. Her father demands, "Get rid of that mutt, he's dangerous." But Max doesn't budge. Rebecca's hand finds his fur and she says, "Leave us alone." Her mother insists, "You're coming home, Rebecca. We've missed you, we're worried about you." Rebecca shakes her head. The security guard at the door moves in and says, "I'm going to have to ask you both to step back." Her father protests. "She's our daughter, you have no right to keep her from us." Max lets out another warning growl. A police officer enters and states, "We'll need to investigate the situation further before any decisions are made. Until then, you are not allowed to take her from the hospital." Rebecca's father opens his mouth to argue, but the officer raises his hand and says, "This is not a discussion. You'll be contacted when the investigation is complete." Her parents glare at her. As they are escorted out, her father hisses, "You'll regret this." Rebecca flinches, but Max presses closer. The room feels lighter as the door closes. Rebecca whispers, "I'll never leave you, Max. I promise." The officer and social worker linger, speaking quietly at the door. Rebecca is lost in her thoughts. The relief of knowing she was safe for now washed over her, but the fear still lingered. For now, though, Max was with her, and that was enough. The investigation ended. The court ruled that Rebecca's parents were not able to support her. Rebecca was sent to an orphanage to wait for someone to adopt her. She was brought along with Max as a therapy dog. The shelter is a quiet place nestled between old buildings and shaded by large trees. Children play in the courtyard, their laughter ringing in the air. Rebecca avoids their gazes, keeping her head down, her grip on Max firm. To Rebecca, it felt like a distant echo, something she couldn't quite reach. "You're going to like it here," Carmen said, her voice gentle but firm. Carmen, the shelter's manager, had greeted them with warmth, but Rebecca remained distant, her shoulders tight with tension. Carmen noticed, but she didn't push. Instead, she knelt down, offering Max a pat on the head. "Carmen, this guy is a good friend to have." Rebecca didn't respond. She didn't need to. Max wagged his tail, his tongue lolling happily, giving Carmen a soft bark as if to say, "Don't worry, I've got her covered." They were led inside to a room with 2 beds. It was simple but clean, the walls painted a soft blue. A window let in light that danced across the floor. Rebecca stood still, taking it all in but not moving toward the bed or the window. She just stood there, holding Max's leash, staring at the space in front of her as if it might disappear if she blinked. "Carmen, you can rest for a bit. I'll come back later to check on you," Carmen said, her voice always calm like the stillness before rain. She gave a small nod, leaving them alone in the room. Rebecca slowly sat on the bed, Max settling by her feet. She stroked his fur absent-mindedly, her eyes unfocused. This was supposed to be a place where she was safe, but everything still felt too new, too overwhelming. The days passed, and Rebecca remained quiet. She avoided the other children at the shelter, retreating to corners with Max whenever they approached. She could hear their chatter, their attempts at friendship. But she was not ready, not yet. But Max, loyal as ever, was always there. He would nudge her hand when he sensed her anxiety rising, his soft nose brushing her palm, reminding her that he was there. His presence was a comfort, a lifeline in the swirling emotions that she couldn't yet untangle. One afternoon, as Rebecca sat in the courtyard with Max at her side, Carmen approached. She didn't sit too close, just enough for Rebecca to know she was there. "How are you feeling today?" Carmen asked gently. Rebecca shrugged, her eyes on the ground. "It's okay to feel unsure," Carmen reassured her. "This place can be strange at first, but you're safe here. No one will hurt you." Rebecca glanced at Max, who rested his head on her lap. And for a moment, she felt a flicker of that safety Carmen spoke of. She nodded just slightly. "I've seen a lot of kids come through these doors," Carmen continued. "Some stay quiet like you. Some want to talk right away, but everyone takes their own time." Rebecca didn't respond, but she felt the weight of Carmen's words settle in her chest. She wasn't being pushed to speak, and for that, she was grateful. As days turned into weeks, Rebecca began to open up, not in large ways, but in small, almost imperceptible gestures. She would sit a little closer to the other children during meals, her eyes no longer darting nervously. She would nod when Carmen asked how she was doing, and she would smile ever so slightly when Max would nuzzle her, urging her to play with him. Max remained her anchor, guiding her through the uncertainty of this new life. And though Rebecca still had a long way to go, each day in the shelter felt a little less frightening and a little more like home. It was a quiet afternoon when Carmen walked into the room, her expression a mixture of hope and concern. Rebecca looked up from where she was sitting, tracing circles on the floor with her finger. "There's a family that wants to meet you. The Simons. They're interested in adopting," Carmen said softly. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment she had always dreamed of yet somehow feared. She had never thought anyone would want to take her in, not with the baggage she carried, and by baggage, she didn't just mean her past, she meant Max. Carmen continued, "They're a kind couple, but they don't like animals. I know Max is important to you, but they've said that they'll come back for him later. You'd go first. It could be a fresh start." Rebecca felt a knot form in her throat. Max had been her shadow for as long as she could remember, a silent companion who never left her side. Abandoning him, even temporarily, seemed unthinkable. "But they promised they'll take him later, right?" Rebecca asked, her voice trembling. Carmen hesitated for just a second, but nodded. "Yes, they promised you wouldn't be apart for long." Rebecca looked at Max lying on the floor beside her, his head resting on her feet. His tail thumped softly against the ground as if sensing the tension. She bent down to ruffle his fur. "I'll come back for you." The Simons arrived later that afternoon. They were, as Carmen had described, warm, polite, and clearly eager to make a connection. Mrs. Simons, a woman with kind eyes, knelt beside Rebecca. "Mrs. Simons, you must be Rebecca," she said gently. "Mrs. Simons, we've heard wonderful things about you." Rebecca managed a small smile. "Rebecca, can I bring Max with me?" she asked, glancing nervously at the dog by her side. Mr. Simons, a tall man with graying hair, exchanged a quick glance with his wife. "Mr. Simons, Max will stay here for now," he said, his tone soft but firm. "Mr. Simons, we'll come back for him after you've settled in. It's just easier that way." Rebecca wanted to protest, to demand they take Max with them, but the warmth in the Simons' voices made her pause. They were offering her something she'd never had, a home, a chance. "Rebecca, okay," she murmured, reaching for Max one last time. "Rebecca, but I'll come back for him soon." Life with the Simons was different. Rebecca found herself adjusting to the routines of a family, something that had always felt foreign to her. Dinners were quiet but pleasant. They asked her how school was going, encouraged her to explore new hobbies, and treated her with a kindness she wasn't used to. Over time, she felt herself relax into the rhythm of their household. But no matter how much she tried to settle in, a dull ache always lingered in the back of her mind. Every night, she would lie in bed and think of Max, alone at the orphanage. She missed the way he would nudge her hand, the warmth of his presence beside her. It had been 2 months, and each time she brought up the topic of bringing Max home, the Simons would change the subject. "Mrs. Simons, we'll see about Max soon, sweetheart," Mrs. Simons would say with a quick smile, but the conversation never went further. Mr. Simons would nod along, avoiding eye contact. Rebecca knew what was happening. The promise to bring Max home was fading, lost in the comfortable routine of her new life. And yet she couldn't forget him. The thought of him waiting at the orphanage gnawed at her heart. Meanwhile, Max remained at the orphanage. Every day he would wait by the gate, his eyes scanning the road for any sign of Rebecca. Whenever a car pulled up, his ears would perk and his tail would wag furiously, only to droop when it wasn't her. Each passing day his excitement dimmed just a little more, but he never stopped waiting. Rebecca had promised she would return, and Max, in his loyal heart, believed her. For now he would continue to wait, lying at the gate, eyes trained on the horizon. The night was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves brushing against the windows. Rebecca lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep seemed impossible tonight. The memories of Max, her loyal friend from the orphanage, weighed heavily on her heart. It had been weeks since she last saw him, and though the Simon family had welcomed her into their home with open arms, something was missing. She sat up, her chest tight with longing. Max must have been waiting for her, confused and lonely, just as she had once been. The thought stirred an ache so deep that Rebecca couldn't ignore it anymore. Quietly, she slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Mr. and Mrs. Simons. She moved quickly, her feet soft against the wooden floor, and soon found herself at the front door, hesitating only for a moment before stepping outside into the cool night air. Her heart pounded as she ran through the empty streets, guided only by her memory of the route back to the orphanage. The further she got from the safety of the Simons' house, the faster her legs carried her. Every step seemed to bring her closer to Max, to the comfort and safety he had always given her. The orphanage finally appeared before her, a dark silhouette against the moonlit sky. Rebecca paused, breathless, scanning the yard. Her eyes locked on a familiar shape. Max, curled up by the gate, his head resting on his paw, his eyes closed in quiet sadness. She froze for a second, overwhelmed by the sight of him. "Rebecca! Max!" she called out, her voice breaking the stillness of the night. Max's head shot up instantly, his ears perked at the sound of her voice. His tail wagged furiously as he leapt to his feet, looking around until he spotted her across the road. Without a moment's hesitation, he barked joyfully and darted toward the gate, his body trembling with excitement. Rebecca's heart swelled with joy, her feet carrying her forward without thinking. She sprinted across the street, her eyes locked on Max's eager face, his tail a blur of motion. But just as she stepped onto the road, a flash of light caught the corner of her eye. A motorcycle speeding toward her, its engine roaring against the silence. Panic surged through her, freezing her in place. Time seemed to slow as the motorcycle drew closer, but before she could move, Max lunged forward. He threw himself against her, pushing her out of the bike's path just as it screeched past. The impact sent Max flying, his body tumbling across the pavement with a sickening thud. Rebecca hit the ground hard but scrambled to her feet, her heart racing in terror. "Rebecca! Max!" she screamed, her voice filled with desperation. She ran to him, her legs weak beneath her as she collapsed beside his limp body. Max lay still, his breath shallow and labored. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment they locked onto hers. Despite the pain he must have been in, his eyes still shone with that familiar warmth, that same unshakable love. He had saved her without hesitation, just like always. Tears streamed down Rebecca's face as she cradled his head in her lap, stroking his soft fur. "Rebecca, no, Max, please stay with me," she whispered, her voice shaking with grief. His tail gave one last feeble wag and his body relaxed against her. Max's eyes began to close slowly, and with one final breath, he let go. Rebecca's sobs filled the night air, echoing through the empty streets. She held Max tightly, refusing to let him go, even as the world seemed to crumble around her. He had been more than just a dog. He had been her protector, her family. The air was warm, a gentle breeze ruffling Rebecca's hair as she sat on the porch, a paintbrush in hand. She leaned over her sketch pad, her strokes light and careful, capturing the soft, loyal eyes of Max. Her lips pressed into a faint smile as she focused on the details of his ears and his expression, one of perpetual joy despite everything. A month had passed since that fateful night. Max was playing with the neighbor's dog. Even with only 3 legs, Max moved with a grace and happiness that made Rebecca's heart swell. His energy, unbroken by his injury, was a daily reminder of resilience. "Mrs. Simons, how's the drawing coming along?" Mrs. Simons' voice broke the quiet, warm and motherly. She approached with a tray of snacks, her footsteps soft against the old wooden boards of the porch. Rebecca looked up, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Rebecca, almost done," she said, her voice calm, more at ease than it had been in weeks. She watched Max leap clumsily yet determinedly in the yard. The sight of him, playful despite the missing leg, brought a deep sense of pride to her face. "Mrs. Simons, he's a brave one, that Max." Rebecca remembered the chaos that followed the crash. Her foster parents had arrived just in time, and they had rushed him to the vet that night. The doctors managed to save his life, but his leg had been too damaged to heal. The decision to amputate was a difficult one, but it had saved him. "Rebecca, I thought he wouldn't make it," Rebecca admitted. The story of Rebecca and Max is one of love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between a girl and her dog. It's a tale that unfolds with heartwarming moments and tender connections, spanning across time and trials, ultimately leading to a place of peace and belonging. Mrs. Simons places a comforting hand on Rebecca's shoulder. "Mrs. Simons," quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "None of us knew, but he did. And that says a lot about him and you." Rebecca blinks, looking up at her. "Rebecca, me? You?" "Mrs. Simons, to share something special. He fought for you because he loves you. We saw that. That's why when the vet said Max needed a home, well, we couldn't say no, could we?" Rebecca's eyes miss slightly, but she blinks the tears away. "Rebecca, I still don't believe it sometimes that he's here, that you adopted him." Mrs. Simons smiles softly. "Mrs. Simons, we don't always follow our own rules, but for Max, for you, it was worth it." Rebecca gazes out at Max, who is now rolling in the grass, his short barks of excitement echoing across the yard. She feels a deep sense of peace, a calm she hadn't known in so long. Rebecca returns her focus to the drawing, filling in the final touches on Max's fur. It isn't perfect, but it is him, his spirit, his warmth. As the sun begins to dip below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Rebecca sets down her paintbrush and stretches. Mrs. Simons stands up, watching her carefully. "Mrs. Simons, you've come a long way." Rebecca smiles, glancing once more at Max, who is now resting peacefully in the grass. "Rebecca, we both have." Mrs. Simons nods. "Mrs. Simons, yes, you both have." The morning sun bathes the Simons house in a soft golden glow. Rebecca stands by the window, watching the world outside as she sips from her cup. Her eyes follow Max, who is happily chasing a butterfly in the garden, his tail wagging furiously. She smiles, feeling a deep sense of contentment that had once seemed impossible. It had been months since she first arrived, fragile and broken, haunted by her past. But now the weight on her chest had lifted, replaced by something she could finally name: hope. Rebecca had found her place in the Simons family, not as an outsider, but as someone loved, cherished, and protected. Mr. Simons, OS. "Ready for the walk, Rebecca?" Rebecca is broken from her thoughts. "Rebecca, yes." Her voice is bright as she grabs Max's leash. The dog, hearing the familiar jingle, rushes inside, circling her with excitement. He had been her constant companion, never leaving her side, always offering a sense of security that words could never describe. They set out on their usual route through the park, Mrs. Simons holding Rebecca's hand as they stroll. Max trots ahead, sniffing every tree and bush along the way. Rebecca glances at the family beside her, her heart swelling with gratitude. There were no longer any shadows lurking in her mind, only warmth and safety. At a quiet spot by the lake, Rebecca pauses. She lets go of Mrs. Simons's hand and crouches down, resting her palms on Max's head. He looks at her, his brown eyes full of understanding. Rebecca whispers, her voice steady but soft. "I've never told you this, Max, but you saved me. You made me feel like it was okay to trust again." Max responds with a gentle lick on her cheek, his tail thumping the ground. He was more than just a dog. He was a guardian, a constant reminder that Rebecca was never alone. The Simons family sits down on the grass, basking in the peacefulness of the day. Rebecca looks around, realizing just how far she had come. The park, once filled with triggers of fear, is now a place of comfort. The family beside her, once strangers, are now her true home. Rebecca quietly says, "Thank you." Her gaze moves from Max to the Simons family. They look at her, puzzled at first, but then they understand. Mrs. Simons asks, "For what, sweetie?" Rebecca responds, "For everything. For giving me a home, for showing me love, for helping me find my smile again." Tears glisten in Mrs. Simons' eyes as she pulls Rebecca into a tight embrace. Mr. Simons places a hand on her shoulder, his face full of pride. Max, sensing the emotion in the air, wags his tail and nestles closer to Rebecca, his presence a constant source of strength. As they walk back home, Rebecca feels lighter, as if all the burdens of her past had finally fallen away. She had found not only a home but a family that had given her the love and safety she thought she had lost forever. Max, forever loyal, trots beside her, his role as her protector more evident than ever. That evening, as Rebecca lies in bed with Max curled up at her feet, she realizes that for the first time in a long while, she isn't afraid of tomorrow. She isn't afraid of anything anymore. She has her family, her home, and her future ahead of her. Rebecca whispers, "Good night, Max." Her hand rests on his soft fur. The dog shifts slightly, his eyes closing as he lets out a contented sigh. Rebecca smiles to herself, her heart full. She knows that whatever the future holds, she will face it with the love and support of the Simons family, and with Max by her side, always. Thank you for joining me in today's heartwarming journey of Rebecca and Max. Stories like these remind us of the unbreakable bond between humans and their loyal companions. Max's sacrifice wasn't just an act of loyalty, it was an expression of pure, selfless love, a love that saved a life and brought a family together. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with someone who needs a reminder of what true loyalty means, and subscribe for more inspiring stories that remind us all of the beauty in everyday moments. And as always, stay kind, stay compassionate, and I'll see you in the next video.